Hello, and welcome back to the Writer's Block. I'm Erica. We got Jeff and Mason here today, and we're going to talk about raising and lowering stakes. And quick heads up, by nature, what we're going to be talking about, if we're talking about stakes, we're naturally going to get into endings. So this is going to be spoiler-tastic. We'll put a nice little list of everything we're about to spoil in the description, so you've been warned. One work I really love that has lower stakes than we're normally accustomed to is Black Panther within the larger Marvel movie franchise. Because normally we're looking at a universe in jeopardy, or a planet in jeopardy, or a galaxy in jeopardy. And in Black Panther, what we're looking at is just one country. And so it feels more intimate. We know personally the people who are going to be affected if their lives get changed, if the villain wins. And so it feels like we have a lot more to lose precisely because we have a lot less to lose.
Yeah, the one that came to my mind because Erica mentioned Black Panther earlier to us was Spider-Man: Homecoming, for a lot of the same reasons, right? All that stands to be lost for the majority of the film is just criminals that have been doing crime for some time continue to do crime, right? And not until Spider-Man's interventions and increased attention is brought on to them do they decide to try and steal some stuff from Tony Stark as well, right? Which is a little bit higher stakes, but still at the end of it, not the end of the world, right? Little bit closer to Earth than the usual Marvel cinematic film might be.
I had a couple different ones that were bouncing around in my head, but it's interesting. Oh, so much to talk about. But I'm going to kick off by saying I'm going to go for an old one, a Xanth story, A Spell for Chameleon. I know that the Xanth series is number one older. It can also be polarizing due to some of the content that happens. But I would say the first book to me is a very localized story. It's about one individual who, for those who aren't familiar with Xanth, Xanth is a magical world. Everyone's got a magical power. But if you don't exhibit a magical power by a particular age, you're basically booted from Xanth. And there's this kid, you guessed it, who magic power doesn't seem to be coming up. What's going to happen? And so it's really just his search for, do I have a magical power? If I do, what is it? That sort of thing. So it's very, very personal to him. And it does get bigger in that he travels around to try to find the answer to that question. But it's not as if, the nation is in jeopardy the entire time or the world is coming to an end. It doesn't have that, huge epic fantasy feel. It's more about like this one person's story, their trial to figure out like, can I belong here? Can I stay in the place I want?
An excellent point to bring up, Jeff, because a lot of times when you're dealing with YA or middle grade, the stakes are just, do I belong and can I make a good life for myself? Some teenage plots do have end of the world stakes if you try to save the world from destruction, but most of the time, especially in contemporary, they don't even have contest plots. Like I can think of a lot of novels that are just, I moved to a school and I'm trying to make new friends, and the worst case scenario is you're going to be really lonely for the rest of your high school life, which in the grand scheme of things isn't important, but in your personal life, there is nothing more important. One YA contemporary work I really like that has drastically different stakes, depending on which version of it you're looking at, is John Green's Paper Towns, the book, and John Green's Paper Towns, the movie. And they have the exact same plot, and the plot is a boy named Hugh has a crush on a girl named Margot. Margot goes missing, and so he's following this trail of clues to try to figure out what happened to her. And he has his friends go on this crazy road trip when they think they pinned down her location. And in the book, the stakes are, is Margot alive? Because you've got his internal narration and any high schooler who sees their friends just up and vanish without leaving any really clear clues, just a bunch of cryptic messages, would be well in the right to think, is my friend dead? Did she commit suicide? And so with that always on his mind, eventually when you do meet Margot at the end, you find out, oh, she's fine. She just made a life for herself somewhere else. It's a happy ending, because the stakes are, did Margot die? But in the movie, you don't have access to his internal narration, so all you see is that his friends disappeared. So it's no longer a is Margot alive plot, it's a does the guy get the girl plot. And I read a review of that by somebody who had not read the book, and he read it as a downer ending, that this couple doesn't get together at the end after he spent this whole 2-hour movie chasing this girl down. And I think that the stakes can both be how a work ends, but it's also what is there to lose. And depending on how much there's to lose or win, that's going to directly inform whether or not you get a happy ending, regardless of what actually ends up happening at the end of the work.
I was going to say, I think it's worth noting too that right now we're talking about kind of low and high stakes, and obviously you covered both, Erica, but the idea that low stakes we're talking about kind of as like a more personal or more isolated scenario, where high stakes is like it's the whole world. And it might seem funny as someone coming in from outside that maybe doesn't read a lot of like fantasy or stuff to be like, why is that conversation? And it's because in epic fantasy, which so many things are going for, it is about the world. Or like for the MCU, it's like the universe. It's like, what is at stake? Everything in existence, right? And so, we're not obviously saying one is better than the other, because as Eric even said with her example, if the stakes are smaller, that can actually make them more personal and then feel bigger, right? And so it's this fascinating juxtaposition almost of, if you do have crazy big stakes about the universe, how do you make that personal, right? And then if you do have stakes that are more isolated, you got to make sure we're really engaged and interested in those characters, because that's the primary focus, is just this little part.
Yeah, +1 to that. And I mean, I would say even one thing off of what Jeff was saying is like, what the reader thinks of the character is important in lower stakes situations, right? Because it's not just about the world. Usually it's about particular characters. And I would say, like, I recently was working on a short story that both Jeff and Erica read, in which a monk was struggling with mental health issues, right? And being such a miserable individual, this monk wasn't necessarily the best person. I don't think he was the worst person either, but he wasn't necessarily the best. And so, but I think that his situation was very sympathetic, right? Like, it was easy to hurt for the person because of the suffering that he was enduring, right? I do think that there are some films that, and books and short stories that do a good job of kind of having these lower scale things on some pretty despicable figures, but they execute in such a way that we, even though they may be despicable, we sympathize with them or empathize with them on some level, and as a result are able to spend that much time with just them as a character, and are able to worry about just them as a character, even though they may not be that great as a character or as like an ethical individual.
Absolutely. I think there's also a lot to say about embedding smaller stakes within a high stake work. I started watching The Mandalorian recently, and last night I was watching an episode where there's a fight scene that I know he's going to win. He's not going to die 6 episodes into a 2. It is 2, right? There are 2 seasons of the series. Yes. I know that this guy's a great fighter, so he's not likely to die anyway. And just the structure of the work tells me he needs to be alive for a while. But there's a fight scene where the stake isn't just is he going to die, but his opponent threatens to take his helmet off. And part of his moral code is he never removes his helmet for anybody. And so while I know he's absolutely going to get out of this alive, I didn't know, is he going to get out of this alive with his helmet still on? And even though I don't walk around with a metal helmet on my face all the time, I definitely sympathize for him, because I've seen over and over again through the past 6 episodes how important that is to him. He doesn't even remove it in front of people he trusts, let alone this enemy.
I feel like, again, so much. This is all so interconnected. There's so many things we could talk about. But I'm just going to go with 2 things based on what's been tossed around. The first is immediate to fight scenes and whatnot. I'm very passionate about fight scenes. And to me, in a lot of cases, some of the most riveting fight scenes can be exactly what Eric is describing, something that we don't know the outcome to, right? And often I find that happens when it's between 2 side characters, because in those situations, you've got a situation where the stakes can be really high because it's death, potentially. Obviously, not every fight between characters is to the death, but the idea is, if it's a side character, they could die. Like, either one of these 2 side characters could die. And so you can have these really high stakes that you can achieve, generally speaking, for the main character early on in a work. But if you do have a fight scene with the main character, like Eric is talking about, that's a really to me, brilliant decision to make it about this little part that we don't know. Will they lose the helmet? Will they lose something that they care about? Will they break an arm and then not be able to compete in the big tournament or whatever it is? Obviously I'm not just talking about Mandalorian, but lots of things. And I would completely agree that if we are especially talking about a main character fight scene, finding an alternate stake, something else that the reader can be unsure about, that can really, even if it's small, because it's very important to that person, it then becomes high stakes. So it's high stakes for the individual about the helmet, and thus it becomes high stakes for us, even though in the grander scheme of things, it's obviously a smaller stake moment. The other quick second thing was, if we look at like series and stuff, when we were talking before about smaller versus larger, one that definitely came to my mind was, what is the name escaping me? Huge. That's they're put together. They're catching. I can't believe I'm not thinking. Hunger Games. In Hunger Games, the first book is obviously very much about her and obviously her friend and so on and so forth. Will she survive? Does she live? So on and so forth. Obviously, incredibly high stakes for her, but not so much at a societal level, though of course there is a little bit of that at the end of the book. But then you get into later novels like the third book, and there is this, big societal change. And so I think that does also beg the question, if you are writing a longer series, right? Do you have to go into larger stakes to create that larger series over time? Or can you continually stay at lower stakes to that individual? Just tossing that out there.
Thank you for bringing up Hunger Games, because one thing that Hunger Games does that a lot of very compelling works do is it's not a yes or no plot, it's an A or B plot. I personally don't think the stakes was ever, oh no, Katniss might die, and then her 12-year-old sister back home is going to starve to death because she doesn't know how to hunt deer and Katniss does. It's, oh no, Katniss could die and her 12-year-old sister will starve because she can't hunt deer, or she kills Peeta. And either one of those is a bad outcome. And so you're reading to see, well, what's the third option? Because we know that she's probably not going to kill the man who's been presented as a love interest. But we also know that Katniss's baby sister isn't going to starve. So the real reason that we're reading isn't to see how she survives the games. It's how she survives the games without killing Peeta.
Until, of course, we already said spoilers. I can say this. Her little sister blows up, right? So it's not going to happen until it does. One thing that I will say about these kind of low stakes things and about the low stakes kind of plot lines throughout a number of different franchises and stories is that I think the old adage rings true. That in specificity, there is universality, right? The more general you are, I think frequently the less resonant a story is. And the more specific it is, I think the more resonant it is, right? And I think that is something that is a tremendous strength of these lower stakes stories, right? Is as we get more specific, as we kind of come down a little bit more to earth, my apologies, as we come a little bit more down to earth, we become a little bit more universal in our stories as well, I think.
I would agree. I mean, we talked about, the stakes of the universe or something. I mean, you got to care about the universe in order to care about those stakes, right? And almost in some ways that can feel harder to why would I care about everybody? Have I met everybody? Do I know what's going on? And I think that does sort of go back to this idea of series that I mentioned. I think that if you do keep it relatively low stakes tied to an individual or a couple people or an area, that's when you get the more episodic stories, right? Where each story is maybe something that's specific to the individual and maybe they connect, maybe they not. We see this a lot with TV shows and stuff, versus a story that is working, and I'm talking again about a series that works towards some big, larger goal, right? And so I think that is sort of just baked into the nature of it. If you're writing a story where there is some big goal and it takes more than one book to get there, that's generally going to be something really big that the person needs, right? If we're just saying can I make a friend? probably you're knocking that out in a book, right? Where it's like, can I take over the world? Okay, maybe that takes a couple of books. Right? Figure out how do they do that, right? And so I think that's really very natural. Though I think you could, of course, make a series where it's about, can I make a friend? Now can I make a love interest? Now can I make another friend, right? Like, and of course you can be doing that as well. And I think that is sort of a difference to keep in mind and potentially think about, when crafting your own stories and deciding, how do I want to kick this off? Do I want to go low stakes or high stakes? And obviously it always needs to be high stakes for the characters who are living it, and ideally then for the reader, in terms of the perception. But having that idea for yourself and then thinking about where you may want to take it, I could help with planning and kicking off the way you need.
Thank you, Jeff. I think that's the perfect thing to end on. Thank you so much for tuning in, for listening to this discussion on how to raise and lower the stakes, and good luck with the stakes that you're upping and downing in your own work. We'll see you next week, Blockheads.